Berlin, March 31st, 1936. Spartacus Wilson reporting from the German capital. This past quarter, Adolf Hitler gambled his regime on a massive military bluff when he sent German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. In the shadow cast by the glowing fires of hope shining from the Winter Olympics in Bavaria, Europe's security was destabilized while the Western democracies did little to stop the slide. Tonight, we look back at a quarter when the already popular Nazi dictator, in the eyes of much of his people, soared to the state of a German messiah, delivering on his promises to restore the nation to its perceived former international glory and military greatness. During the first quarter of 1936, the international community remained preoccupied with Italy's ongoing invasion of Abyssinia. The global economy remained in a fragile, uneven recovery from the Great Depression. The winners were Japan, the British Commonwealth, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, while France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Poland remained the most stuck in depression, with the United States and Belgium in between. The general trend was that those that had left the gold standard and deflated their currency early were recovering the fastest, while countries with currency still tied to gold were lagging. Germany was also in recovery, at least on paper, but as we shall see, the strong focus on rearmament continued to hold back recovery for the overall economy. Beyond that, in February, Germany hosted the Winter Olympics in the Bavarian towns of Garmisch and Partenkirchen. The regime recognized the immense propaganda value of the games and meticulously stage-managed the events to impress foreign visitors. Anti-Semitic propaganda was temporarily toned down, and visible signs of persecution were quietly removed from the game's sites to avoid spoiling the Olympic atmosphere. However, behind this peaceful facade, Hitler was preparing a massive foreign policy strike by reoccupying the demilitarized Rhineland. Since 1919, the Rhineland had been demilitarized as a buffer zone between Germany and France and Belgium, where Germany was prohibited from stationing troops or building fortifications. Significantly, the region's status hindered Hitler to exploit the region's heavy industry for his rearmament programs because of the ban on military construction. Moreover, while it was occupied by Belgian, British, French, and initially American forces between 1918 and 1930, the region suffered economically and even after occupation lagged behind. Remilitarization would restore German military freedom in the zone and enable future fortification and forward defense. On March 2nd, he informed his top military commanders and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels that he would order the Wehrmacht to reoccupy. Reliable sources inside the Wehrmacht tells us that the military leadership, particularly Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg, was highly anxious, while Hitler was convinced that the Western democracies were distracted by the Abyssinian crisis and too politically weak to act. Despite the military reservations, on March 7th, an initial spearhead by a small force of German troops crossed the Rhine bridges. On the same day, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, announcing the abrogation of the Locarno Pact, defining Germany's western borders as inviolable, but also the demilitarization of the Rhineland, while simultaneously offering a series of hollow peace proposals, including a 25-year non-aggression pact with France and Belgium. Hitler had gauged the international mood correctly. In fact, he may even have underestimated the lack of interest in taking aggressive action. In Great Britain, the remilitarization was publicly rationalized as a justified action in Germany's own backyard, a complacent attitude underscored by the London Times editorial headline, "A chance to rebuild." The French government did consider a military response and unsuccessfully pleaded for British backing and action by the League of Nations, while the French General Staff held back anyway, warning that any military operation could come with unpredictable risks and require a general mobilization. The head of Universal News Service in Berlin, Bill Shirer, summed up his frustration with this inaction to us. "Hitler's gotten away with it. France is not marching. Instead, it is appealing to the League. All the stupidity, or is it paralysis, of the French?" He also shared some inside information showing that it would have been a cakewalk for the French to oust the Germans when he told us, "I learned today on absolute authority that the German troops, which marched into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland yesterday, had strict orders to beat a hasty retreat if the French army opposed them in any way." But that didn't happen, and to capitalize on his triumph, Hitler immediately dissolved the Reichstag and scheduled a plebiscite and new elections for March 29th. The subsequent campaign was a masterpiece of propaganda, transforming the military maneuver into a crusade for peace and equal rights on the international stage. When the votes were tallied, the regime claimed a 98.9% approval rate. While these numbers may have been manipulated, there was no denying the genuine, overwhelming popular support for the Rhineland occupation, cementing Hitler's unquestioned authority over both the state and the reluctant military establishment, to not mention even more free range to pursue his policies of racial suppression. The temporary easing of visible persecution during the Winter Olympics offered no real respite for minorities. Behind the scenes, the bureaucratic machinery of exclusion continued to grind forward. While spontaneous street violence was officially discouraged, the systematic economic and social strangulation of the Jewish population accelerated. The regime also utilized the Gestapo to enforce the Nuremberg laws ruthlessly, actively pursuing cases of race defilement. The Gestapo is, in some cases, independently extending the penal consequences for this crime by rearresting Jewish men who had been released, sending them to concentration camps indefinitely. In the press, the propaganda ministry orchestrated the public mood with military precision during the Winter Games. So effectively was the narration and the orchestration of a friendly Germany that many foreign visitors were taken in by the charade. To those who had seen the true face of the Nazi regime and its Germany, it was quite disturbing. Bill Shirer, covering the games on location, tried to do something about it. I was so alarmed at this that I gave a luncheon for some of our businessmen and invited Douglas Miller, our commercial attaché in Berlin, and the best informed man on Germany we have in our embassy, to enlighten them a little. But they told him what things were like, and Doug scarcely got a word in. And when the Winter Games had concluded and the Rhineland was reoccupied, the press was careful to project friendliness while they unleashed a massive, coordinated campaign to glorify Hitler's decisive action. Journalists were strictly ordered to avoid the word war and to frame the occupation as a defensive measure. Hitler himself masterfully utilized the compliant media to project his image as a national savior. In his radio broadcast March 7th speech to the Reichstag, he dramatically proclaimed, "In this historic hour, when in the Reich's western provinces, German troops are at this minute marching into their future peacetime garrisons, we all unite in two sacred vows to swear to yield to no force whatsoever in the restoration of the honor of our people." Shirer was present during the speech and described the scene. It is news to this hysterical parliamentary mob that German soldiers are already on the move into the Rhineland. All the militarism in their German blood surges to their heads. They spring, yelling and crying, to their feet. Their hands are raised in slavish salute. Their faces now contorted with hysteria. Their mouths wide open, shouting. Their eyes burning with fanaticism, glued on the new God, the Messiah. The Messiah plays his role superbly. Following this, the propaganda ministry forced every newspaper to devote its front pages to the election campaign, ensuring that no alternative narrative could exist. The German economy experienced severe growing pains as the demands for rapid rearmament continued to clash with civilian consumer needs. The recovery was skewed while consumer living standards lagged, exports stayed weak, and rearmament plus foreign exchange controls increasingly distorted the economy. Unemployment continued to drop significantly, falling from close to 6 million in 1932 to roughly 1.6 million by 1936. That number was in no little part manipulated. The real number who have found actual employment is about 2 million. The remaining 2.4 million who no longer count as unemployed have been artificially removed from the statistics. By mid-1934, some 400,000 youths and over 600,000 unemployed had been drafted as emergency laborers in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, Landhilfe and Notstandsarbeiten to perform heavy manual work for wages that barely exceeded their former unemployment benefits. Some 230,000 female domestic servants have been exempted from mandatory unemployment insurance, effectively removing them from the jobless count. Additionally, married women pushed out of the workforce as double earners have often stopped registering as unemployed because they are deemed not in need and are ineligible for benefits. Lastly, the reintroduction of military conscription in 1935 has now removed over 1 million from the civilian labor market. Many of those who have actually found employment have gone into the arms industry. The sheer scale of the rearmament effort is now staggering. For instance, in 1933, the annual aircraft production was 368 planes, which almost tenfolded to 3,183 by 1935 and is projected to reach over 5,000 planes in 1936. While only about a quarter are combat-ready aircraft, most of the remaining three-quarters are intended for military use as trainers and logistic craft or produced ready for a later conversion from civilian to military. Economics Minister Hjalmar Schacht warned that the pace of military spending was unsustainable and now threatened inflation. However, Hitler ignored these constraints and pushed the economy further towards a state of mobilization that masks severe structural deficits behind the illusion of full employment. In fact, the entire Nazi leadership seemed unperturbed by this financial Damocles sword they have hung over their heads, and the mood within the party transitioned from anxious anticipation in January to ecstatic triumph by mid-March. As the Rhineland gamble paid off, the party elite reveled in their success, as Joseph Goebbels noted on March 10th. England remains passive, France does not act alone, Italy is disappointed, and America uninterested. We have again the sovereignty over our own country. A great day is over, much nerve strain, but also a wonderful success. With Hitler's aggressive instincts validated, a mood of invincibility within the NSDAP upper echelons solidified. The public sentiment during the quarter followed a similar pattern, with an initial wave of intense fear of war, which rapidly transformed into overwhelming euphoria. The remilitarization of the Rhineland struck a deep chord with the great many Germans who despised the Versailles Treaty, with the bloodless victory seen as proof of Hitler's genius. Our enthusiastic Nazi maiden and gardener apprentice Inge Thiele waxed lyrical on March 11th. The Führer is striving for friendship. His voice often shook with emotion and responsibility. One must simply believe him and approve of it. In Hamburg, Luise Solmetz, caught between her nationalist sympathies and her worsening domestic situation as the wife of a Christian husband whom the regime classified as a racial Jew and mother of a daughter stigmatized under the racial laws, captured the paradox of national elation and erosion of civil rights in her own situation. In March, she told us that she was delighted by our soldiers marching in and Hitler's greatness, the sheer might of this man. Yet, later that month, when Nazi flag-hoisting rituals turned the streets into a public sea of flags, she noted that her own family's unflagged flat was painful and discriminatory for us. We will have to learn to bear it, exposing how anti-Semitic exclusion was her bitter price for the national resurgence. Even among those who despised the regime, Hitler's successful gamble generated resigned awe. The day after remilitarization, Jewish academician Victor Klemperer told us, 3 months ago, I would have been convinced there would be war the same evening. Today, Vox Populi, my butcher, says they won't risk anything. General conviction, and ours too, that everything will remain quiet. Hitler's new act of liberation, the nation rejoices. What does internal freedom mean? What do we care about the Jews? The way the events of this quarter played out and the accompanying Nazi propaganda converted relief and nationalist enthusiasm into broader acceptance and deeper emotional identification with Hitler. To this reporter, it looks like that France and Great Britain have missed a huge opportunity to serve Hitler a checking blow. Had Hitler's gamble failed, it is by no means certain that his regime would have collapsed entirely, but it would with certainty have suffered a serious setback at home. If nothing else, it would have struck a deep chasm between Hitler and the Wehrmacht generals. That he could have failed is obvious. The German forces that marched into the Rhineland was only 3 battalions, and across the border 13 French divisions were ready to be deployed. Moreover, as Shirer confirmed with his sources in the Foreign Ministry and the Wehrmacht, had the French responded, Blomberg would have pulled his forces back. Even if he didn't, we also know that despite the accelerated rearmament, the Germans are far from ready to go to war with the overwhelming combined forces of Great Britain and France. And so, the first quarter of 1936 marks a critical turning point in the consolidation of the Nazi dictatorship. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was not merely a foreign policy triumph. It was a domestic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the relationship between the regime and the German people. By successfully tearing up the Locarno Pact without firing a shot, Hitler has neutralized his domestic critics and proved his cautious generals wrong. It strengthened the bridge already closing the gap between the radical Nazi core and the traditional nationalist middle class, who viewed the restoration of military sovereignty as a legitimate and necessary goal. The subsequent election campaign was used to deepen the emotional bond between Hitler and the masses, transforming relief over avoided conflict into active adoration. The regime successfully masked its aggressive, expansionist ideology behind the rhetoric of peace and equal rights on the international stage. Consequently, the public's willingness to tolerate economic hardship and ignore the formalized terror against the Jews and political opponents hardened. The Rhineland victory created an illusion of bloodless conquest that has fatally lowered the German public's resistance to any future military gambles Hitler may undertake. Or should I say, probably will undertake. Because like Bill Shirer tried so hard to make the influential American visitors to the Winter Olympics see, the writing is on the wall. The Nazi Reich is not a friendly nation. Behind the Führer's sweet-talking about peace and stability, Germany is on a path to war with much of Europe. And if the rearmament keeps accelerating at the pace it is, and if the international community keeps allowing Hitler to get away with murder of the international order, what a war it will be. May the gods have mercy on us. Never forget. Join me and our team to use the knowledge of history as a tool to resist falling back into the traps of the past by joining the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com.